Our guest is Leila Philip, author of Beaverland: How One Weird Rodent Made America. Beavers have played an outsized role in developing our river systems and our vegetation, and they can play a major role in helping us deal with climate change, in restoring our water cycles, and dealing with wildfires. This is the Climate Water Project at climatewaterproject.substack.com.
Cool. Well, today we have here Leila Philip, who's the author of Beaverland. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be with you.
Cool. I'm glad to have you on. So, let's start a bit with your background. So you studied literature or English, is that right, when you were growing up?
Yeah, well, actually, if you go back even further, I grew up on a farm, on and off a farm in the Hudson Valley.
Hmm.
And I think one of the great gifts of growing up on a farm is you're often, as I've said before, really hot and bored. So we'd end up in this pond, this kind of stinky pond. So I actually spent a lot of time swimming around with frogs. I love to swim. And I think they were kind of the prequel to beavers. But yeah, I studied, actually, I did East Asian studies as an undergraduate in college. And then I really wanted to be a writer. I actually wanted to be a journalist. And so I took a year off before college and worked on a newspaper. And then I actually went out to Oregon, worked as a tree planter and on a sheep ranch. And then came back and finished college. I studied in Japan. I really wanted to learn Japanese. And my major in college was actually medieval Japanese poetry. And, everybody said, oh, that's really impractical. But actually, it was an incredibly wonderful, practical major for me. Just opened my eyes to language. So I kind of explain it now. I'm a writer by nature, but I'm a journalist by training because I actually worked on a Japanese newspaper for several years. Because I could speak Japanese, I got a job on the Yomiuri Shimbun out of Tokyo, worked in New York, then worked in Tokyo. Then I went back to school and got an MFA in fiction because I really fell in love with nonfiction storytelling, that form. In fact, my senior thesis at Princeton would become my first book. So, I really knew that I wanted to write early on. And I also had always been, I would say, interested in the intersection of sort of humans and the natural world. I think from growing up on a farm, because, that a farm is a place where the human and the wild meet. Um, and I think it was really great training for that.
Yeah. And so, and your first book, was that about Japan?
Yeah, yeah. I studied ceramics in Japan because I think all that swimming around in the pond, I really loved mud. And then I started, I loved making ceramics. Um, you know, I loved making ceramics. I loved writing, but you just can't do everything. And I think one of the great lessons of apprenticing in Japan, well, there were many, 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 but um, one was it taught me a lot about writing because I made hundreds and hundreds of rice bowls and I just couldn't fall in love with every one. You
Mm.
just make them, you move on. And it was great training actually to be a writer because, that discipline of just sitting at your desk and doing it is a large part of getting a book done or getting an article done. You
Mm.
can't fall in love with every sentence. You'll never get anywhere.
Right.
So, although I laugh because writing Beaverland, was sort of became, I think, like many book projects, a kind of fever dream that just wasn't over till it was over. So I would spend 6 years on Beaverland because I just became so fascinated by beavers and all I was learning. And then um, I had so much fun writing it. So, but anyway, yeah, that was my first book. And then I worked as a journalist, and then I spent many years teaching. I still teach and helped found an environmental studies program at the college where I teach, which is College of the Holy Cross in Worcester. It's a Jesuit college. So, you know, I give this writing exercise to my students and say, what keeps you up at night? You know, what are the stories you urgently feel you need to tell? It's a way of kind of helping them connect with what's important to them. And I always do the assignments with my students, and I kept finding that I was saying the environment. You know, back in 2012, I was just desperately worried about climate change. So I thought, well, I have to really kind of think about this. And I really shifted all my teaching into environmental studies and helped my college found a program and then a major. And then I started writing a column for the Boston Globe, an opinion column regularly, and my beat was environment, politics, and culture. And so I just really started shifting my work toward writing about the environment. So that was, you know, I was already doing that before I met my beavers, but I met my beavers by accident. You know, I wasn't planning to write a book on beavers. It just I met these beavers, and that was it.
What was that initial experience with beavers?
It was totally by accident. I was taking a walk with the woods with my dog, as I, you know, did twice a day as a break from writing at my desk. And I was walking in the woods and I heard this bam, and I didn't know what it was. I literally thought maybe a gun had gone off. And I looked to where my dog was looking, and there was this small brown head swimming through the water. And in fact, that was crazy because just a few days before, that had been a brown swampy area with no water. So suddenly it was full of water. There was this small head swimming back and forth, and bam, the beaver slammed her tail again. And I was just hooked. I mean, the tenacity of this animal. And she was telling me to get lost. And so I would go down every day and watch this growing pond, and this beaver. I swear she was watching me more, just as much as I was watching her. And it just became the anchor of my days. It was incredible, the transformation of this wetland. You know, now that I understand the science, it really still makes my hair stand on end to think about what was happening. So I live in Woodstock, Connecticut. It's, you know, northeastern United States. It's southern New England, pretty much environmentally devastated part of the country early on, right? It was, you know, the fur trade devastated the area first, and then it was timbered. But here's this beaver that was basically restoring the wetland there. And pretty soon, wildlife was coming. This gorgeous pond spread out. By the end, I was measuring it, and it was almost a half-mile long, just incredible. So when my beavers disappeared, I then was devastated and tried to figure out what had happened to them. And that's very much the journey of Beaverland. And also I started, you know, researching everything I could find about beavers. And it just, the more I learned about beavers, the more fascinated I became.
Mm. So how long did it take that beaver to make that pond around?
Well, it's interesting because here in the Northeast, in our woodland areas, if there's some woods around, beavers can build a dam really in like 2 or 3 days and start the process of ponding. So um, the two beavers that had moved in, within about a week, they had felled a tree and really had a pretty good sized dam built up in a pinch point where the stream went through a narrow area. And like beavers do, they'll make use of natural features. So they had built it along a existing stone wall, which was really interesting. So this, I now understand that that swampy area that I thought was just a kind of nothing burger is actually a historic beaver meadow. So there actually would have been beavers there going back hundreds of years, if not thousands, throughout the Holocene, if not before, because that small stream is part of the river network, and beavers will move into the stream network. They'll build a dam, swell it into a pond. They'll build a series of dams, swell it, live there for a while, and then after a certain period of time, they'll move on. And then the the dam will break down, the pond will, release its water, and it will grow up in shrubs and have a kind of succession where it goes into beaver meadow and eventually grows back into forest. And it turns out that that is incredibly important for the forest ecology and the plant ecology, as well as the healthy ecology of the river system. But if we just talk about the hydrology of what's happening, that wetland is vital to the functioning of the river system. So when, it's just the subtitle of the book is How One Weird Rodent Made America. And it's just not an exaggeration. They made America. So, in terms of the social history we've had with beavers, because they jump-started our first economies, right? So as soon as people figured out in Europe that there were beaver pelts to be had here, they were so valuable to people that, ships just sailed across the Atlantic and they jump-started transatlantic trade, literally. And then by the 19th century, they jumpstart and rev up. They don't jumpstart, but they rev up really the engines of capitalism here as a commodity that's being shipped back to London. And, a beaver pelt had a markup of something like 900% if you could get it to London. So you can imagine how people are hungry to get into the fur trade. And you can also imagine how quickly people were greedy for this and over-extracted it. So by 1900, the beaver is pretty much wiped out throughout North America. But what was even more incredible to me to learn was not just the way beavers, shaped our first economies here, but that they literally shaped the river systems, helped shape the geography and the watersheds of North America. That just blew my mind. So that when we actually trapped them out, geologists call 1600 to 1900 the Great Drying. It was actually the first environmental devastation on North America that was, perpetuated by Euro-Americans, by colonization. And that was the first big hit to the river system that would really, really impact the water web or the water cycle here, whatever, words you want to put to it, or the river system. And then would come timbering and other industries and infrastructure. But the first big hit was the fur trade, because beavers are part of a healthy ecology of the river system. And that's huge. And it's also really exciting because they're also one of our greatest conservation comeback stories. So we now have beavers back, and they're being harnessed throughout the country as part of nature-based restoration programs. And that, to me, is like such an exciting, wonderful story that, needs to be told, and was really a major part of the story I wanted to share with readers.
Wow. Yeah, so beavers have played a big part in in the history of the North America in several ways, right? One, it kind of created the rivers and the wetlands. And then two, it actually created this whole economic engine. And then now perhaps we're going to have a third chapter where it's going to help with eco restoration and climate resilience.
Yeah, I think, beavers already are. I mean, everywhere that there's a beaver out in the watershed doing its beaver work, it's restoring the river system, and so we'd be a lot better off, the more we can support beavers, create habitat for them, coexist with them. Here in the East, where it's more crowded than out West, the default has been too often to trap them out when they create flooding problems. Say, in my town, if beavers flood a road, the default has been to just trap the beaver out and not recognize all the value that they bring. And there are a lot of problems with that because historically, maybe there were enough beavers that they would move in, but beavers need our support now because more and more people are finding that if they do that, there are not enough beavers around to move back in. And so those really good beaver habitats are staying empty. And like in my town, we had serious flooding last summer with scalding rain events. And I think here in the East, we're kind of waking up to some of the problems with extreme rain and that the West has been experiencing for some time. We don't get atmospheric rivers of rain like California has had, but we've had really bad flooding in the East last summer, Vermont, other places, even here. And what was interesting was areas of my dirt road were completely flooded where there were not beavers, but the places where there were beavers that the town wanted to trap, but they hadn't gotten to it yet, they held the water. And that's because those wetlands are sponges. So they're managing the water. And
Mm.
so now we can have a conversation with the highway department and say, hey, look, you know what? If you want the pond to be a little lower and you can be a little more comfortable, let's put what's called a flow device or a pond leveler in, which is pretty much like a permanent hole in the beaver dam. So you can lower the level of the pond and the beavers can stay because that beaver pond is a biodiversity hub. So it's helping the larger ecology. But also, look, we had this flood and it didn't flood there. The road was actually dry where the beavers were. So that's proof that that wetland underneath the visible basin of the pond is this invisible sponge. And this is what's really exciting to me now. And you have to be careful because I get so excited about this, I'll just go on and on. So you can interrupt me. But one of the things that was really amazing to me to discover was that, I thought, okay, beavers come to my woods and they build this pond that is just drop dead gorgeous. That's enough. But then I realized, and I would learn that what's maybe even more significant in terms of ecology and river health is underneath that visible basin is a sponge of water that's holding here in the east at least 3 times as much water as the basin of water you can see. So if you think about that, the math of how much water is being held in the river system by beaver ponds gets big really fast because beavers never build one dam and one pond. They'll build a series, almost like a series of terraced rice fields along a creek or a stream. It's almost like imagine a string and then beads along a chain. So each of those visible basins of water, now you've got 3 times as much water held in the soil underneath this big sponge. So it's a sponge of water that's ready to rehydrate the stream system if you get a drought. And it's ready to soak up water if you've got a scalding rain event. So it's drought protection, and out west, it's wildfire protection because it rehydrates things, and it's flood mitigation. Huge amount of flood mitigation happening. And like here in my little town, we just saw it last summer. And the other thing is these, sponges, if we can call them that, um, they also serve as big, like coffee filters. So as the water is slowed down in this sponge, it can sink down into the aquifer. And as it sinks down, it's cleansed. So it's cleansed of really a pretty important pollutants, important because they're really harmful, like nitrogen and phosphorus, things that we really need to get out of the water system. But it also cleanses sediment. So out in places like California, they're actually restocking beavers up into the watershed because when wildfires go through, these beaver wetlands do an incredible job cleansing the water of ash post wildfire, in addition to like pollutants, right? Around where I live, where there's a lot of agriculture, the cleansing of nitrogen is super important. So just the function of these wetlands to the river system can't be underestimated. And I think, the statistics of how many wetlands we have filled and dammed up in the world are pretty distressing to think about. I think in the United States, we've lost half our wetlands. We've filled them up, or we've dammed, somehow we've degraded them. I think in terms of the world, it's something like 87%. But so we really can't afford to fill more of them. And we really need beavers to create more of them, which is what they do. And this is part of what's called the hypereic zone of the river system. And it's something I'm really, really interested in now. I'm actually working on a new book about rivers and thinking about this a lot.
So the beavers have played, it seems like they've played a huge role. So they both, they've slowed down the water so that there's more water during the dry season. And during the wet season, they also like control the flooding. And then also because it's hydrating the environment, there's less wildfires. And because they've created these ponds, it's also allowing the water to cleanse. So it seems like they've played a huge role in the history too of like, I guess where they were in Europe and North America. Could you give a sense of how many beavers there were and like what influence or what percentage of the geography of Europe and North America was impacted by beavers?
Yeah, well, I mean, everything. So, I mean, every watershed was full of beavers. And I don't know Europe as well as North America because my book is really focused on North America. But if we can just concentrate here, although there's a really robust rewilding program of beavers going on in Europe and in the UK. And it's really fun to watch. And that's partially because the EU had said that the restoration of riparian borders around rivers was an important priority because they're having so much problem with flooding. And so pretty quickly, people realized having beavers in the equation was going to be important. So there's been tremendous support for it. So in North America, the estimate is that from 60 to 400 million beavers filled the continent. And I mean all throughout North America. And Voyageurs National Park is got the highest density of beavers left in the United States. It's a really interesting place to look at because it's out in Minnesota, up in the boundary waters between the United States and Canada. There are a lot of big lakes up there. And they do an annual census of beaver lodges. And the park is young. It was founded in 1976, and they've been doing an annual census since, I think, 1959. And since the beavers have been allowed to, basically rebound there without human pressure, I recently looked at a map and it's extraordinary. The entire park is like covered with yellow dots, which are all the beaver lodges. And that's what North America would have once looked like. There just would have been beavers along every river system. And I think we need to think about them as part of the ecology of the river system. And this goes hand in hand with, I think, a paradigm shift that's happening, as I understand it, in river science now, where up until now, I think river scientists have really focused on the physics of how water moves through a river. They hadn't thought as much about the biology of the river, and the biology being the interaction of plants and animals. And beavers are part of that biology, and they're a big part of what actually helps slow the water down. So do log jams, for example. And I was just out in Oregon last week looking at a site on the Mackenzie where the Forest Service has literally put 4,000 logs into a valley area to try to give the valley back to the river, sort of give the land back to the river, sort of with the idea that we need to start thinking about where the river wants to go, not think about the river as this channeled, ditched area of flow that goes one direction, but let it slow down, and that's through the role of the beaver, right, to slow the water down. So once that water is slowed down enough, beavers can move in and then help with that process. But they need the river's moving so fast now that beavers can't thrive there yet. Although we actually saw one beaver lodge in one area where they had started the restoration, and the upticks in things like endangered Chinook salmon are just incredible. In a matter of months, they've seen upticks. So I think the restoration efforts that come with a change in thinking are very exciting, but they have to begin with thinking differently about rivers, thinking differently about things like beavers. You know, they're not separated from the river system, they're part of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a really big deal because I think when we first learn about rivers, we're just taught that it's the rain coming down and it's carving out, through the soil and the landscape, these channels, and it bends and it goes to the sea. But really, if like if the beavers, as they are, like there's hundreds of millions of them, they're actually in all the river systems, they're changing the actual river shape and the ponds and the wetlands that form off of it and how much it laterally moves and flows in the floodplain. So it's not like a small thing. This is like an integral part of the whole North American landscape that the beavers have changed. And we can't just think of it as just water moving through the landscape. We have to couple the beaver with the river. That equation is what defines how we understand the whole water system.
Yeah, and I think, in Beaverland, I really set out to show how beavers are central to the health of the river network, and that we need to think about it as a vast circulatory system. So if we
Mm.
think about it as a circulatory system that pulses water through the continent, then like by building these networks of dams, beavers create this kind of rhythm of ponds and wetlands and then beaver meadows. And it's not just these structures that we see. Like in the beginning, that's what I thought was so cool. These structures we can see that are in a process of change, right? So that's why I call them the Shiva of the animal world, right? They, it's like destruction and creation that we can see. They have to chop, they cut down a tree to make a pond, and there's that motion that we can see. But actually, that's just the beginning because there are these ecological, biological, hydrological, geomorphic processes that actually profoundly impact the ecology and function and thus health of the river system. And that's a lot of that's happening under the ground where we can't see it. And I think because we can't see it, we haven't valued it. And I sort of write a whole new afterword to Beaverland in the paperback where I try to make this point to people because for me anyway, the Sackett decision last May just so horrified me. It was that Supreme Court decision where 5 Supreme Court justices basically overruled like decades of a bipartisan, decision in Congress, and they, overruled science to say that the Clean Water Act only applies to kind of visible continuous water. And that's just not how the river system works. In fact, something like 70% of the tributaries can be intermittent at different times. So they're going underground, they're coming back up. And this is really personal for me because since Beaverland's come out, I've been monitoring a beaver site near here. Again, I call them my beavers, but you know, uh, I went out to see the beavers after, like, literally the week the book came out, and I was devastated to discover that a human had broken their dam, and the pond had gone down so low that they had to flee their lodge. And this was December, so in a normal winter, it would have been fatal. But last winter, it was freaky warm. So I actually hiked down and I found them farther down the stream network. But what was interesting was two juvenile beavers, basically adolescent beavers, had survived. I don't know what happened to the rest of the lodge, but these two had survived, and they had built a dam across a dry area. So an area that I had walked through in November and my sneakers were dry, and they had ponded it. So basically, they had enabled subsurface water to come up. So they had enabled a hidden section of the stream network to come back to the surface, which is just think about that for a minute. It's fascinating, and it raises all kinds of questions because people have observed beavers damming up running water. But I was observing beavers go to a very different kind of situation here. So how did they know that there was water underneath? I mean, kind of consultation with different mammalogists and river scientists about that. And actually, Dr. Jordan Kennedy, who I profile in the book, she's that scientist from the Blackfeet Nation who was at Harvard when I interviewed her in Beaverland. She actually has a really good theory about why, because she thinks that we have overlooked the value of beaver canals. But so anyway, my point is, before the beavers had dammed that up and enabled that subsurface water to come up, anyone could have built a house there, or with this new ruling, they could build a house there or do anything to it. But now that there's water there and it's obviously part of the stream network, you can't. But you see how flawed that ruling is. 70% of the river network is now vulnerable to pollution and development. So that really alarmed me. And I thought, we, the citizens of the United States, maybe the citizens of the world, have to become educated about our water. And we have to step up and protect it and learn about the water where we live. Because otherwise, people who have other interests will just do other things with it. And water is just far too precious. I mean, as you know, you're doing all this incredible work to bring attention to an awareness of water.
Yeah, this subsurface water is really key, and when beavers slow the water down and create these wetlands and ponds, like that allows the water also to seep down underground and go into the aquifers. And I think yeah, because as you're saying, like it's out of sight, so it's a little bit out of mind, but really it plays such a key role in the whole ecosystem because it kind of that allows the streams to keep running and also the tree roots will bring up that water and it's like that water's maybe hidden, but like because it can be brought up, it also retards fires and the groundwater is a huge part of our system that somehow we forget about.
Yeah. Well, I also, if I may, I've just been really interested in the kind of ecological connectivity that happens in that groundwater, in that hyporeic zone too, because, say I'm a microbial organism and I'm going down the current, I can only go one way. But if I drop down into the hyporeic zone, this kind of shadow river that runs underneath the river system, underneath every creek or stream, then I could go right or left. I can even go back upstream. It's like a whole web of connectivity. And I think we're just barely starting to understand the importance of that connectivity. So when we take that function away from the larger ecology, all kinds of microorganisms and all kinds of geochemical processes are being interrupted, right? Their connectivity is being stopped.
Can you explain a little bit more this hypereric zone? So there's rocks and pebbles at the bottom of the river, but underneath that you can have water, and that water then you're saying can go in different directions, or what exactly is happening underneath there?
Yeah, I mean, as I understand it, and I'm learning more and more about this, there's you might think of it as a shadow river underneath the river network. So there's another flow that's going through the soil, and it can extend as deep as 30 feet underneath the river, depending on what the structure of the soil is. or it can be shallow. So, so that's really interesting. And then a wetland is the wetland kind of sponge is part of that hyporeic zone. But even in a fast moving current, there's another current underneath it. So I think if you think of it like a kind of a shadow river underneath, and it's moving through the soil. So there's groundwater moving through soil all the time. We just don't see it, so we don't think about it. I guess we think about it if our basement's flooded, like then people confront it. Then they're like, where's this water coming from? And that's an example where people have to deal with the fact that there's water moving through the soil, right?
And what speed is that around that? Is it quite a bit slower than the river in the hyperrev zone?
It must be. I mean, it can't be moving at the same rate. Yeah. But I think there's so many variables. As I'm learning about it, it's very complex and fascinating. And I'm interested in the biology of it. I'm interested in the different organisms that depend on that. It's the same way I think we are at a new frontier of understanding the mycorrhizae and the fungal networks that not too long ago we didn't understand created connectivity in the soil between, fungal networks and the roots of trees. I think we're going to understand that there is a lot going on in terms of connectivity with soil and water once we reconnect these rivers, because it's just really interesting once you start thinking wherever we can, if we give land back to the river, and by the river system, I mean, it could be a creek, it could be a stream. It's all part of the river system. I mean, that was one of the things that really was a light bulb moment for me in writing Beaverland, was tromping around with Dr. Birkstead, that wonderful geomorphologist in the White Mountains. And I kept saying, like, where's the river? And she'd say, look down, it's under your feet. And I would just see water moving through the grass like a flowing meadow. And she'd be like, that's the river system. Remember, it's just water made visible. Because I kept looking for the river out of storybooks, and the rivers that I had grown up with, which are degraded, is the degraded river system, because we, and by we, I mean, Euro-Americans who arrived here, and we harnessed water for power and for, energy, for transportation. Then we started trying to move water to irrigate things, right? So we benefited a great deal from all this water. And, as I say in Beaverland, the conversion of natural resources is the propelling force of empire. But we just can't keep doing that in this moment. Like, we have to change that thinking. And I think this seems to be so much part of what you're interested in, is a new way of thinking about water and understanding water. Because I think our survival is going to depend on it.
Right.
I also want to make a point that I think is kind of interesting. We've just been talking about the way we've thought about beavers and rivers, say from 1600 on, colonization. But I begin Beaverland with the Great Beaver story quite intentionally to kind of disrupt the usual way we tend to write about environmental science, which is to posit, the Western scientist first. And, not too long ago, that would be a guy. But I really wanted to begin with a story from an indigenous culture, and then I actually share knowledge from another marginalized group, which is the fur trapper, and then I get to kind of Western science. And the structure of the book is really intentional, because I think we are at a moment where we, on one hand, have, awe-inspiring technologies, but we really haven't learned how to live on this planet sustainably. And, if you just think about rivers, I think this is something guests on your show have probably talked about and you know very well, but we've dammed up so many of the world's rivers. We've just stored so many thousands of cubic kilometers of water in places it didn't used to be that we've literally changed the length of a day on Earth. So, if you think about that like the weight of all this dammed up water has altered the rotation of the planet, and that as a result, each day is a few microseconds shorter. That is really jaw-dropping technological power that we have as a species. So we have all the technology we need to survive, but we we have this power before we have learned how to live on our planet sustainably. So I think we're in this awkward phase, and in many ways, we would be well to go back to some of the teachings, say, here in North America that have been on this continent a long time. And the Great Beaver story is an example of that, which is why I wanted to open the book with that, and why I weave through a lot of indigenous ecological knowledge, because the Great Beaver story is um, it's about the dangers of hoarding resources, basically. And there are a lot of Algonquian stories about the dangers of hoarding resources. So, and the Algonquin peoples lived up and down the Atlantic seaboard. I live in the Northeast, and they in through the Great Lakes. But there are great beaver stories throughout North America, I would discover in the writing of this book. And there are very different great beaver stories out in sort of the arid high plains, like the Blackfeet had, you know, different stories, but still they revered the beaver as a teacher and a protector. And, I just think in indigenous environmental science or ecological knowledge, as it's called, even the term keystone species, which is how Western science talks about the beaver, which acknowledges the tremendous importance of the beaver to the larger ecology. That if you take beavers out of the ecology, everything starts to fall apart, just the way if you take a keystone brick out of a medieval arch, the arch will fall. So Western science has known for a long time how important beavers are to the larger ecology of species. But if you call a beaver a keystone relative, which is how a scientist like Dr. Jordan Kennedy out, and she's working out in Montana now at Indigenous Led, a really interesting outfit, and they're doing research on the beaver bison relationship and grass in the high plains and the hydrology out there. It they would say beaver is a keystone relative, which implies not just what the beaver can do for us, but what we need to do for the beaver. And so conservation is wrapped up in science. And I just, now that I've written Beaverland more and more, I think we need a reset. And we need stories that can help us, show us how to do that reset. I think it's happening. Nature-based restoration is about that reset. It's about working with nature and the power of nature and the natural world rather than trying to just always control it. And I think people, there are a lot of movements around that need more airtime, because otherwise I think we get overwhelmed by all these stories of doom and gloom with climate change and feel like there's nothing to be done.
Right. Well, nature-based restoration is a big business and big movement now, right? And how are beavers integrating into this, and what role do they play in the whole nature-based restoration movement?
Well, I think here I think state by state it varies, but out west, California is using them for watershed resiliency. So California has a statewide beaver working group, and interestingly, they translocated or restocked beavers back into the watershed for the first time in 75 years. And I think California is a great example of a state which actually mismanaged beavers for many, many years, but then did a dramatic U-turn in 2023. And from the top down, Governor Newsom, I mean, there were many, many people who have been working very hard um, throughout the state. And actually, indigenous tribes and communities had been trying to get beavers back, but until the state said, okay, this is our priority, there were, a lot of impediments. And
I actually interviewed Brock Dolman on this show, and I
oh,
think he
great.
played a big role in
Absolutely.
volleyball. Yeah.
Yes. And Kate Lundquist and the Maidu Summit Consortium and the Tule tribes, you know, quite a number of players have been working for years. But then, you get then the governor saying we're going to do this, and then it can all kind of fall into place. And so did he talk about the 7 beavers that were translocated in October?
I'm not sure. I don't think he
Not
did.
sure. Okay. Well, anyways, 7 beavers went back into Maidu, historic Maidu mountain lands, and they're doing well. And this summer, beavers are going into the Tule tribe lands and their other sites. So they've done the prep work for them. Beavers are going back. So beavers, as part of wildfire mitigation, watershed resiliency, water cleansing, basically slowing the water down, and money for coexistence strategies. That's big. There's $2 million in the state budget. So if you or I had beavers flooding our town roads, we could go to the state and say, help us with some funding so we can keep the beavers for biodiversity and all the benefits. And we're going to put pond levelers in or flow devices so that we can keep the beavers here and we don't have to trap them out, which had been the default. Oregon has a similar $1.5 million for coexistence strategies, and they're changing the legislation they removed them from the predator list. So uh, Washington has a similar kind of bill in the legislation now. It's called the Dams Act. And it's supported by something like 80 organizations and tribes. So again, money for non-lethal responses to beavers. Here in the East, state by state, there's a lot of coexistence work going on. And the Beaver Institute in Northampton, Massachusetts has national working groups. They have a goal of trying to have a beaver help hotline so that anywhere in the country, if you have a beaver problem, you could call this hotline and say, help, beavers are flooding my road. What should I do? And they'll help you get connected to resources and people who can respond to that in a non-lethal way. And interestingly, quite a number of fur trappers are engaged in this. So they're using their knowledge base to help in non-lethal ways, which is, again, I think an example where people can learn if they have the proper information, and understand what's at stake. And I think that's the human part is really important.
Mm.
The
Well,
pivot, you know.
well, it's good to hear all these different states are doing these beaver programs. I have
And oh, Utah, sorry, I forgot Utah. Utah's doing a lot.
Cool. I have a different question. Why do beavers build dams?
Oh, yeah. Well, you and everybody else wants to know the answer. And I think nobody really knows why they started, which is kind of a fun evolutionary, biology question. Um, but they basically need, they're the only animal apart from man that builds, or humans, I should say. That's kind of sexist to say man. They're only animal apart from humans to build the habitat they need to survive. So beavers need water. So they're brilliant at building. So they build a dam to create a pond, and they need water because they're pretty much water farmers, right? So they live off aquatic vegetation. It's a myth that they need to keep cutting down trees to eat. They do survive at times of the year on the underlying bark, the cambium, but they don't get much protein from that. They basically like to eat shrubby, things along the shore, aspen, willows, and they eat a lot of aquatic vegetation. And of course, it varies region to region where they live. Out west, they'll eat a lot of cottonwood. Here, they'll eat wild blueberry. Um, they'll eat a lot of water lily tubers and cattails, and then all kinds of duckweed and things that grow in the pond. So, and they're also, they're this kind of I love beavers because they're this animal mishmash that I describe in the book. They've got these bear-like faces and these kind of humanoid hands with these dexterous fingers. They got these goose-like hind feet and this crazy big paddle tail, but they're pretty awkward on land. So they need water to survive to get away from predation as well. And they are very vulnerable to being a coyote snack or a wolf snack on land. So they 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 need water to get away from the things that might like to eat them. So I have three wildlife cameras up on the beavers I'm watching here, and I've been pretty shocked to see who is stalking them at night. Bears and bobcat. A lot of people would like to eat a beaver.
Right. So basically, the beavers created a more watery world for themselves, slower, they slowed down the water and then created these ponds that they could then avoid predators. And so in a way, the reason they proliferated to hundreds of millions in the North American continent was because they had somehow evolved this mechanism that allowed them to, recreate the landscape.
Yeah, and it's interesting because obviously you can't only have, a river needs fast flowing areas and then slower areas. And it's interesting because for a long time people thought that you had to remove beavers to have trout populations and have salmon, because salmonids are cold water fish. And actually beaver ponds, we now know they warm the water in certain areas, but they don't warm it across the board, and it's kind of complicated. I won't go into all of that. Certainly certain areas are warmer because they're shallower, but it actually turns out that wherever there are beaver wetlands, there's a huge explosion of population growth for salmon, and they're being used for salmon restoration programs out in the Northwest. And led by a lot of indigenous tribes, the Tulalip in Washington and down in the Klamath. Many indigenous tribes are bringing in beavers as part of nature-based restoration to increase populations of endangered salmon. And in the Mackenzie, where they've started, and they saw an uptick right away in endangered Chinook uh, egg, you know, spawning, and they also saw a big appearance for the first time in years of bullhead trout, which was interesting, which are quite rare. So that's another aspect of using beavers, not just for hydrology, but for biodiversity, and to bring back different kinds of species that are on different lists, amphibians, fish, and all, different birds. Here in the beaver pond that I'm watching, the first year it was in, these cerulean warblers that come all the way up from South America were spotted. And so people were really excited about that because they need a particular kind of woodland pond as a migratory kind of stopover. And so migrating waterfowl, things like that, it's really beavers play a role in that. So that's where the keystone species, keystone relative comes in. But I think the interesting thing that we haven't talked about, but beavers are also important for the plant ecology because there are certain, there's certain types of trees that need disruption in order to germinate. So, and the forest needs disruption to have more variety and heterogeneity. So, beavers will come in and, you know, create a pond, which kills an area of the forest, right? So trees there die, but then when it grows back, different types of trees grow. So there's more variety. So it was also very important for the health of the forest overall. So you didn't get this kind of monoculture evolving of only a certain type of tree. And, that we haven't even talked about that.
And does it actually help create more trees to create more shade, which cools the stream? Is that true? Or
I'm sorry, help to what?
that then helps cool the streams so that the trout and the salmon like it better?
Yes. Yeah. There's a lot of cooling that happens. And, there's a whole conversation about that in terms of, you know, the evapotranspiration. And when I was up in Hubbard Brook, the long-term research center, they were really monitoring that in terms of because that entire watershed in New Hampshire has been allowed to, been set aside and they've been studying the entire watershed. And beavers have been in there playing around now for, gosh, going on 70 years. They're starting to see the stream system and the forest kind of responding. So, what Dr. Berkstead and others call paleo rivers, rivers before colonization, are starting to appear. And when I was up there with Dr. Bailey and Dr. Berkshire, they were pretty excited by some of the trees they saw growing up in the beaver meadows. And it's just very exciting to see. The point they kept making is we don't know what a paleo river looks like because we've never seen it because we weren't here 300 years ago. And this is something the river scientists were also saying. They're doing these valley resets where they're letting the river have the valley back. And they're really excited to see what happens because they're not quite sure. We've never seen it.
Right.
They have kind of a theory. They know it's going to be a lot slower. It's going to be interbraided. It's not going to be just one channel. But so far, the explosion of plant ecologies and the very rapid response of different species coming back is sort of surprising people how much is coming back and how fast. So it's pretty exciting, I think.
Right. Cool. And these beavers like to build their dams and their lodges, which are the houses within the ponds, like they're kind of sometimes pretty complex, right? They have to use different materials, wood, algae, other things, mud. And so could you say a little bit about the beavers' intelligence and also their emotional lives?
Oh yeah, it's such a great topic. Well, I think the bottom line is that beavers are so understudied as an animal. Um, we don't we don't know. What we don't know is a lot more than what we do know. And even in these two young beavers that I've been monitoring, and when I send anecdotes and ask questions of beaver scientists and mammalogists, they're like, "Oh, that's interesting. We've never seen beavers do that before." So I think there is a need for information because, in general, what beavers do has been studied more than the animal itself. But I think uh, it's worth looping back to people like Dorothy Richards, who I write about. She was that woman in 1930s started having beavers in the southern Adirondacks and wrote the book Beaver Sprite. And she was really discounted in her time as kind of the crazy beaver lady. And certainly some of the things she did were a bit eccentric. She let the state allow her to raise two beaver kits in her house, which nobody would do today. But she made some key observations about beavers that they did have a very complex social life between one another, and that they seem to have a lot more reasoning ability than had been uh, identified. And that has been backed up by study after study now that people can follow them with kind of robot beavers and stick cameras into the lodge, we're just seeing behaviors that support some of her observations, which I really like, because I like giving her a shout out. I think she's an example of a citizen scientist who was ignored, partly because she was a woman and just the time. And but it seems as if beavers really have an interesting social dynamic because there's no alpha beaver, so they seem to get along with. They're very affectionate with one another. They raise their kits with a lot of care for 2 years. And then the adult kits or the subadult kits, when they're 2 years old, they go out. And that's why the beavers I've been watching, it was probably just that spring they would have left. So they were pretty much ready to go, which is probably why they had survived. But when I got them on camera, they were constantly talking to another. It was really so kind of adorable. It was like they were just chitter chattering all the time, like, are we doing it right? You got this. And it was one of the ways in which I was able to figure out how old they were, because only young beavers would be chattering to one another like that. And it was almost like they had regressed a little bit from the trauma, I think, of suddenly being, refugees in December and losing the rest of their lodge. And
Wait, you're
there's,
saying they use language to teach each other how to build these dams?
I don't know if they use language. I think they were just reassuring each other. But young beavers,
Oh,
baby beavers will just you can Google it and hear them. They just like chitter chatter to one another all the time. They
mm.
constantly kind of echolocating to one another, just chattering. And it's and then after about 2 years they stop. And so these 2-year-olds were constantly talking to one another as they were eating, as they were making things. It was really interesting. And they still talk to each other quite a bit. So I think they might have regressed somewhat from this trauma. And it's also been interesting. They've had setback after setback. And so it's been interesting to document and watch how they recoup and how they kind of figure things out. Like their dam got completely washed away, and they don't have adults with them anymore to show them anything, right? They're completely on their own, and they're a sibling pair. And when their dam got washed away by a major scalding flood event this summer, when I went back to see how they rebuilt it, they rebuilt it with rocks on the top. So they clearly decided what they had done before wasn't sufficient. And I thought that was interesting. So they were changing it up. Um, to what extent was that instinct? Had they seen their parents do that before? I do know from a lot of beaver science is anecdotal, and Dr. Berkstead had told me that she and other scientists who I've talked to have said they've often been in the woods and they'll see these little dams that they look like practice dams, and their theory is that the young beavers kind of, before they go out on their own, just kind of do practice dams to practice their skills while they're still with the lodge, because they were kind of like crazy silly dams that didn't have any function, and around a healthy community. So, and they had sometimes seen the younger beavers just making them. It's almost like, the parents were like, go keep busy, go make a dam. It was, they were not like serious dams. They were just maybe the young beavers practicing. So I thought that was interesting. So maybe they had practiced somewhere, but they clearly made mistakes and were recouping from those mistakes. Some of the beavers in observation have definitely identified that they they get very attached to their handlers. They kind of like to play almost tricks on them. And they do this thing where they rise up on their two legs and they kind of wiggle and make this kind of chuckling noise when it seems like it's an expression of humor. And Dorothy Richards had observed this as well. She said her beavers would take one of her oriental rugs and pretend to drag it into their pond. remember, they were living in her house. And when she would put her foot on it and shake her head and say no, they would rise up and just shake their hands and kind of like laugh at her. Like, and she said they were just playing tricks on her. And people ignored that, but it's been documented in other situations now.
Well, that's so interesting that beavers might have a sense of humor.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not something scientists are probably usually studying. Or
Well, I don't know. We know octopuses dream, and Franz de Waal had this famous study about capuchin monkeys with their sense of justice, right? I mean,
Mm,
I think we have not understood how to look at animals because we've always looked at them from our human lens.
right.
And,
Yeah.
we've always looked for the ways they're like us. And this is where I thought Dr. Jordan Kennedy was so interesting because she said, look, we really need to think about them in a different way, more as a collective. And that if you don't just try to think about the individual cognitive intelligence of one beaver, but rather the collective intelligence of the group, then you can maybe get more understanding of how they can do the incredible things they can do. Because, I have seen beaver dams that are just remarkable. Most people, you probably have yourself. I mean, they can be huge and incredibly durable. I mean, the beaver dams that I found out in Michigan, tromping around after Lewis Henry Morgan's, you know, with the map from his 1868 book to see if I could find any of the dams still up that he had observed out there in the Upper Peninsula near Marquette from his book. He documented them 150 years earlier, and who knows how long they had been there when he documented them and I saw them. So not only are these constructions big and significant, but they endure. So that means successive generations of beavers are working on them. So that gets pretty interesting.
To think about how beavers might have a culture, they might learning and like and maybe as we kind of create this more eco restoration movement, they're part of it. Maybe they're also learning new skills or learning new ways to interact too.
Yeah, I think if we can if we can learn as a species to, as I say, kind of reset our relationship to the natural world and learn from it rather than always trying to control it, we're just going to be so much better off. And it was one of the reasons why in this book I really wanted to design it around going around and around my own beaver pond and uh, just in a very disciplined way have everything come out from observations of where I live. Um, because beavers are, they're so ordinary, they're extraordinary. And I left this book thinking, we have overlooked beavers for so long. What else are we overlooking? Uh, that's probably right there, uh, waiting for us to learn from in the natural world. We've got all this technology. In a way, we sort of don't need, I mean, we always need more, but we've got this imbalance in our thinking about the natural world. And I do think that the most important thing right now is for us to shift our kind of our attitude. Because if we keep thinking about the planet as this big vending machine, we put $1 in, we get a Coke. It's just, I just think that is our problem.
Right. Yeah. Cool. Well, maybe we could almost wrap up here. I just want to ask you about the title of your book, Beaverland. Is that what they used to call America, or is that a name for a certain part of the land?
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, the title came from Herb Sabansky. I first heard it from Herb Sabansky, that fur trapper that I went out with in the swamps here.
Hmm.
So we were like, I was practically up to my waist in water. He was standing on a beaver lodge and he just looked around and he just said, with so much like joy in his voice. He said, "This is Beaverland." And I just, I don't know what he's talking about, but that's kind of cool. I wrote it down.
Ah,
And
okay.
then later I thought, actually, North America is Beaverland and was Beaverland. And in many ways, um, it still could be Beaverland. And so I just thought, okay, that's got to be the title of the book. And then I think, other people have used it. I think in the sources I then set about, because I love research, to try to figure out anybody who had used that term. But there's a funny kind of story about the subtitle, How One Weird Rodent Made America, because I was pretty committed to that subtitle.
It's a catchy subtitle.
Well, some people were like, "What are you talking about? You can't call beavers weird. That's so disrespectful." And I said, we could use a little humor around here, you know. And once you read the book, you'll get it. So I just want, I think, you know, s stories really can change the world. I think we're story making animals. I mean, I've spent my life thinking about story, but I think the stories we tell ourselves about who we were and who we are and who we want to be really are important. And I wanted this to be a story that could have some humor, that didn't avoid the darkness, because, we really devastated the environment here. The indigenous peoples here, really suffered in colonization. But at the same time, beavers show us a way forward that really can be our collective future. So it's just an amazing story. And beavers on this continent have been held up as teachers for thousands of years.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much for this conversation.
Maybe it's a little off the topic of water, but as you can see, I'm still pretty passionate about the topic of beavers.
I think it's very related to water. They're like so fundamental to our water system.
Well, they're just I think, the indigenous peoples who had strict protocols about hunting them, even where they did hunt them, or in the arid high plains out in Montana, later day Montana, would not hunt them at all. They understood their importance. And I think that's
Mm,
pretty impressive. You know,
mm,
um, if you think about the Blackfeet, that means they understood the grass ecology, they understood the hydrology. They relied upon the bison, which relied upon the grass, and they understood that beavers were critical to the river system, which the grass needed, which the bison needed, and they needed the bison. So it would be foolish to hunt your beavers. And so they didn't. It was
mm,
forbidden to hunt beavers. So when the fur trappers came and said, please give us some pelts, they would give them wolf, they would give them other things and try to distract them and say, here, have this instead. Um, so but on a more serious note, I think it really shows that in these stories of the great beaver, there's a lot of profound understanding of ecology and science.
yeah.
These are the oldest stories of the continent, some of them.
Right. Yeah.
That's pretty amazing. I mean, humans figured it out.
Yeah,
We've
I do
just
think when we talk about history, I don't think we give important enough role to beavers since they did influence so much of the geography and vegetation of the continent.
Well, I think it raises an interesting question about why, because here in the United States, we like symbols like bison, we like eagles, because I think they fit this, you know, American vision of big and strong and kind of empire building. But beavers don't really fit that. You know, once I had learned everything I'd learned about beavers, I thought, they are much more important than eagles and just as important as bison, but nobody really wants to own them. So that's partly why I did the title of the book. how
Mm.
one weird rodent made America, because I was just gonna say, no, you have to face the fact that it was all about beavers, and they're 36 inches tall, and they have four ever-growing orange teeth and a big tail, and they're a rodent, and that's your history. So, and it's a good history.
Right.
Plus, they're very cooperative. Um, they're not aggressive. There's this hilarious story about beavers, if I may, where in winter, there was this outfit. They had a camera in a beaver lodge, and some muskrats showed up. And beavers don't particularly like muskrats. And they're they'll live in the same pond without strife, but they don't particularly fond of them. And so the muskrat wanted to move into the beaver lodge, and the beavers were kind of like, like trying to hiss at it and trying to get it to go away. But muskrat was like, "Here I am. It's cold out there," and it had its straw with it and everything. And so the beavers built a wall, and the muskrat just stayed there all winter. I just thought that's really classic beaver. You know, not just find a way and work it out. So that doesn't fit a lot of our American psychology, I think. I
Cool.
wish it.
Well, thank you again.
All right. Well, thank you.